Welcome to Green Giants, Titans of Renewable Energy, the podcast where insights and innovation meet. Every episode, we dive into conversations with industry leaders, experts, and change makers, bringing you the stories and ideas in the renewable energy sector that shape our world. And now, let's jump into today's episode with your host, Wes Ashworth. Welcome back to Green Giants, Titans of Renewable Energy. Today's conversation is about one of the most important topics in clean energy that does not get nearly enough attention: reliability. Not reliability as a slogan and not compliance as paperwork. We're talking about the operational discipline required for renewable energy to function as critical infrastructure. My guest today is Kellie Macpherson, COO, Compliance and Security at Radian Generation, and a board member at SEIA. Kellie has spent years helping renewable asset owners navigate NERC compliance, cybersecurity, managed security services, audits, control centers, and the real-world operating demands of the grid. This conversation comes at a critical moment. NERC Category 2 requirements are bringing more inverter-based resources into formal reliability oversight. At the same time, cybersecurity threats to critical infrastructure are becoming more visible, more geopolitical, and more operationally consequential. So today we're going to unpack what changed, who is exposed, what renewable operators should be doing now, and why the future credibility of clean energy depends not just on building those projects, but on operating them with discipline, resilience, and trust. With that, Kellie, welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I'm super excited. I've been a longtime follower of your podcast and the work you're doing. So thanks for having me today.
The pleasure is absolutely mine. I'm really excited to get into it. And as always, I kind of just want to start with the human side of this. So compliance can sound abstract from the outside, but reliability only exists because there are real consequences when the grid fails. So you've spent your career in a field, people would describe as technical, maybe a little dry and visible. What first made grid reliability feel personal to you?
Yeah, well, it's really interesting. I grew up, my dad was an operator at Southern California Edison. And so I knew a lot about the grid, I guess, kind of through osmosis growing up around that, hearing about my dad's work before cybersecurity and kind of some of the physical security requirements. I used to go to work with my dad, and sit in there, and I go back and forth to like the Richter scale and like grab the printer papers and like take them to his desk. And, it's funny. I remember I was probably, I think 11 or 12. We had the Northridge earthquake. We were living in Southern California at the time. And my dad was the shift supervisor, on staff, and I was babysitting my brother at home, and the earthquake happened, and then the power went out of my house. And so, I called my dad, and I was like, "Dad, the power's out at our house." He's like, "Kellie, I know." He's like, retrospectively, you're like, "You're running the grid right now. Of course, the power is out." And it's funny, they definitely prioritized, folks in the control room that had family at home that for restoration on the grid and got our power back. But, I grew up with stories like that, right? Like, understanding like, oh, this, huge chaotic event happened and my dad's working really hard trying to restore the grid, trying to bring things back together. Later, when I started undergrad, in between like my senior year of high school and starting my freshman year of college of undergrad, I worked as an operator at the California ISO as an intern. And that was during the California energy crisis in 2001. And, we spent the summer with blackouts and brownouts, right? Where you just you didn't have enough generation to bring online. And so that was a really pivotal moment for me, watching what was happening and seeing the day to day, and then, going home and watching it on the news and understanding, people are just talking about these things all of the time. And then it was really interesting. One night I was sitting on the generation desk planning for the next day ahead, realizing that we didn't have enough generation for the next few hours. And so we were in a situation, I feel like I've told this story a lot, but everyone says they really enjoy the perspectives. But, it's those pivotal moments, right? So I'm sitting at the generation desk, I'm 18 years old, and I'm looking at the hour ahead, and I'm like, we don't have enough generation. There's not enough megawatts on the grid to power what we have going on. And so I was looking at it, and you're like, okay, what are the biggest power sources? What are we going to do? Where are we going to move? And it was realizing there's 2 hospitals, and one of them's going to need to be tripped offline. And so, making those phone calls to the hospitals and saying hey, are you prepared? Have you checked, so called hospital A, hey, have you tested your backup generators? What situation are you in? Do you have enough diesel? And, we're in the situation where they've been tripped offline a lot this summer. So it's not just like, right, like you needed to check in. And I'm like, yeah, like we're fine. However, we are in the middle of a heart transplant and, we have so many hours and it's like very critical. And like, we are a little nervous that if you switch over to backup power, the piece of equipment that they were using, the machine is like being your heart for a while, like while they do the heart transplant. And so they were like, we've never actually like gone through a hard backup with that machine before. So if there's any way not to trip us offline, if you could buy us 4 hours, that would be amazing. So call Hospital B. Hospital B is like, oh yeah, like we've tested our backup generator. We just got the diesel refilled yesterday. Like we're good to go. Trip us offline. Let us know what time. We're like, okay, call Hospital A back. We're like, hey, we're not going to trip you guys offline. But that was like one of those moments where you're like, gosh, like this is the power of life and death. Like this is, the grid reliability and power and energy and all that is so much more than just like, about solar films and the politics and all of that. At the end of the day, it's truly about reliability, and that really matters. And it does affect people's lives.
Yeah, absolutely. I love all of that so much. I think that is one of the most powerful like origin stories and just how you got into this, how you got passionate about it, how you got interested in it. I love just the kind of the second generation of, seeing it and living it from your dad's perspective as a kid even. And I've said this a lot at the show, but like, parents out there, like bring your kids into this, show them, bring them to work, get them excited about it. That'll help us build the next generation as well too, and the workforce. But such a powerful story there, and such a powerful why. You can definitely hear that come through really strongly. And I know, so your story does cross this kind of like operations, compliance, cybersecurity, renewable development, executive leadership. A lot of different facets there. Anything else where you saw early in your career that made you believe just renewables had to take reliability more seriously?
Well, so interesting. I had that experience as an intern, and then I went off and did some nonprofit management and things like that in my early 20s. And then when I was 26 years old, I was working for a nonprofit, and my dad said, Kelly, what are you going to do with your life? Like, are you going to get serious? And I'm like, I am serious. He's like, well, you can't have a bleeding heart forever. Like, like you gotta get a grown-up job. And so he's like, come work for me. And I worked for my dad for a while doing NERC compliance for traditional generation, right? And really helping, just regular power coal, regular power plant, nuclear power plants be compliant with the standards, building their programs. And then in 2012, it was actually the day after my first daughter turned 1, I went to work in renewables, and I went to Recurrent Energy at the time. And it was one of those moments like making the transition from traditional generation. So, I was spending my day to day talking to the regulators, talking about traditional generation, and everyone understood like, oh, well, this is a coal plant and this is how it operates. And right, like everybody like it felt like in my world prior to renewables to 2012, like everyone knew what a coal plant was, and this is how you make a coal plant compliant, right? And this is how it's reliable and all that. And I came over to renewables and I realized, oh my gosh, like there is such a disconnect between the two, right? And you realize, I always joke, and I probably should stop joking, but like, you're like, renewables at the time, 2012 felt very much like the finance bros world, right? Like it was just like, so many people coming on finance and like, oh, this is like this great financial economic opportunity, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, and I came in, I'm like, whoa, okay, like super cool. Love the economic, like that's awesome. But you guys are kind of forgetting something really important. Like you're not understanding this reliability. And so like, they're like, hey, we've got this IA the interconnection agreement that we're trying to close. And, they're giving us a hard time, and they like think that we're not going to do something correctly. And there's something about relays. And then I'm like, look, yeah, that would make sense. Right. And so you start digging in, and you're like, well, yeah, they're worried about reliability. Like, like this is a voltage constrained part of the grid. I remember very clearly, like the first month of being at Recurrent, I got pulled into a room with like all of the executives that like I didn't know at that time. Like later have all become like very good friends of mine, but it just kind of the newbie, right? And come in the room and they're like, whoa, why do they care about this? Like, we don't want to do these relay upgrades. Like it's going to add 18 months to construction period and blah, 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 right? Like all these things. I was like, well, let me just draw you a picture of Southern California. And Fresno is this like very voltage constrained portion of the grid. And so they're very worried about voltage control, and they want all these things to happen, they want the site to function correctly and to be a good neighbor and to do all these things. And they're like, oh, and then problem solving through that to be like, okay, well, why don't we say like, we can follow it, this like constrained voltage schedule. We can, bring in batteries and like, right. Like, and you start like problem solving from like the reliability perspective. But no one at the time when I walked in that room, like nobody understood why like the utility cared and like why it mattered. Right. And so I feel like for sure, in my first really 5 years on renewables was really spent bridging that gap between utilities and renewables and trying to like, hey, utility, like, just so you know, like, we're willing to do whatever you want. Like, we understand this is a voltage constrained, but like, is there a better way to do this? Is there a faster way to do this? Like, do you actually have to go and install the relays? Or like, hey, could we go and install this equipment and then transfer ownership to you? Because we can get this all done in 4 months if you let us like run with the construction schedule. And then the utility's like, oh yeah, that would work, right? It's so interesting, but really bridging the gap between the two because people just like don't, because you had these two very different type of people that didn't understand that at the end of the day, yes, everyone cares. Renewables are not trying to break the grid. We never were. We just didn't understand why something was important. But then utilities, on the other hand, we're not very nice. It's like kind of like an old timers club, like, who's this new person? I'm very suspect of you. Like, why do I have to explain everything to you? Everyone else I work with makes my job easy. I don't know. So I feel like, like that was kind of like that bridge into renewables for me. And so it just really helped. I think I speak both languages. And so I've spent so much time just like trying to pull those teams together and help people, understand.
Yeah. Yeah, you're like the unsung heroes of the industry, right? I think that bridge is so important. And we've seen that, if you go back in time to where you're saying and you look at today, yeah, there's still work to be done, but just how much more seamless it is, how much more connected it is. Everybody's speaking a little bit more of the same language. And so having those people that like yourself, where you couldn't bridge that gap and, kind of be that translator of worlds, I think that's so critical. And I think will be one of the more important things too, as we go forward. So I like that lens a lot. So we've kind of talked through, set the stage a little bit, your career, and I think understanding, like, I love how early this started for you, how long you've been just like, this is what you live and what your day in the life every day is like. But I want to talk a little bit about compliance and this credibility test for renewables. And I think the renewable industry, like we talked about over that time, has done an extraordinary job scaling, and a lot of because of people that can bridge gaps and translate, and we get there. But as clean energy becomes just a larger share of the grid, expectations change. Like it's a positive thing, but also creates some challenges. So the question is no longer just can we build it? It's also can we operate it as critical infrastructure? And a lot of people hear NERC compliance and their eyes gloss over and they think paperwork. And tell us a bit about that. Like, why is that the wrong frame? And how would you just help them feel a little bit more excited about it?
Well, I think, it's interesting. I feel like I can get people that are developer owners, like really excited about it because they can like, I see how that can change in the future. I see how like doing this well from the beginning makes it easier to get through process going forward, right? Because you're always like, oh, these people are so much easier to work with, right? And that makes a difference, right? It really does. But, so much of it is this idea of, the solar farm can be just as compliant as the coal facility down the street. And they both can offer the same electrons to the grid and solve the same electron crisis. And, that's what we're looking at here is an electron crisis in the US. We're definitely entering into some like really potentially scary times. And I think that's where, when we think about compliance and we want to think about long-term stability, if you are an IPP, if you are a developer, if the future of your business is dependent on more renewable generation coming online, compliance is the ultimate trump card that makes utilities feel comfortable with what we're doing. Because if we do compliance well, then they're like, oh, yeah, I'm happy to add more solar. I'm happy to add batteries to our generation mix in our, in our ISO, in our area, because I know that you're going to follow the voltage schedule. I know that you're going to do outage coordination correctly. I know that you're going to follow cybersecurity best practices and patch all of your equipment. And you're not just this like rogue agent out there that's going to like cause threats to everything, right? And so I think compliance becomes this ultimate trump card. And I think that's what I just feel really passionate about, that, like wanting people to make sure they understand like what a big deal it is, right? It really is a really big deal and it really makes an impact. So
Yeah, I agree. You paint that picture beautifully, and then you hear it and understand like why this is so important and so critical to pay attention to and be ahead of. But you've used that phrase, and I want to spend a little time on that sort of electron crisis. I think that's a powerful statement. Like for you, like what does that mean? What do you see from your side of the equation? And then just why should renewable developers, IPP investors, and operators care?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. And we talk a lot, a lot of my role in SEIA on the board, a lot of that comes from there, thinking about, what is important for the industry, what's important for the electrical grid going forward. And you spend a lot of time thinking about this and talking about this. And at the end of the day, can you go through an hour of your day and not hear about AI right now? Can you go through an hour a day without a data center or, some type of like iPhone, like update, your photos going to the cloud? Literally our day-to-day lives, hour by hour, are driven by technology, right? And the technology just continues to change. I mean, we're moving so fast. So just like think about our culture in the United States, in the world, our culture is shifting and we're going through this major cultural shift, which then means that it's changing the way that we live our everyday lives, right? Like we are now deploying tools and technology that we've never used before that require more power than was required before, right? The computational load of just our lifestyle at this point. So our culture is changing. Our society is shifting. The way we live our day-to-day lives is shifting and changing and all of that. And what that then requires is more electrons to the grid. Well, here's the thing. We are building and adding electrons to the grid to a stressed infrastructure, right? Like we don't have a transmission system. We're 10 years behind on transmission and where we really should be for what we have now. We have antiquated equipment out there, keeping up with all of that, right? You have that issue. And then you have just like the pure sheer need for megawatts to meet the electrical grid. And so all those things together, all now, I think we find ourselves in what I would consider an electron crisis. Like we do not have enough electrons currently to sustain, like if we continue to grow and have the priorities that we do going forward. And so I think that's where, I think a lot about like, okay, so the other side of this, and maybe I'm getting ahead here a little bit, but, I like to think about, so like explaining all that, like, and what's happening, we're not going to slow anyone down, right? Like, it's like, okay, I don't know if anyone else is this way, but like I'm going through like the 13-year-old pain of like having a phone. My 13-year-old daughter, like has a phone and you're like, oh my gosh, like get off the phone. Like, what the heck? Like you've like unlocked this like monster that like can never, like doesn't stop using the phone. You're like, oh my God, like we need a phone detox in my house. Okay. Same thing like our culture. Like we're not going to change what we're doing, right? Like it's the same thing. Like, oh, this AI thing, this and this new technology and this new app and this new thing and this new way. We're not going to slow any of that down, right? So next question, what's the quickest way to solve the electron crisis? Like what is the quickest way to get electrons to the grid? Well, it's not building a coal or nuclear plant or a hydro facility that's going to take 5 years at minimum just to get through the federal permitting process. Like that's not going to do it. What's the fastest way to bring electrons to the grid? If you had 6 months, what are you going to do? We're looking at batteries. We're looking at some solar, right? Like renewables have the answer to the electron crisis. The problem is people get nervous about renewables because of this reliability issue. And they're like, oh, they're just these, rogue agent outlaws on the grid. And it's like, no, they're not outlaws. We're going to follow the compliance practices. We're going to do the right thing,
Yeah.
So.
Love it. The phrase, electron crisis, I think captures the stakes really well. And you've just brilliantly said that in just terms of how important this is. And we are the answer, but the other side, that the compliance and reliability has got to come alongside it or it doesn't work. So yeah, I love that so much.
And I guess the other side of it too is like, and then we don't want to break it, right? So it's like, we need to prove all the naysayers wrong. We need to show them that we're not, we're not bad agents, but then we also have to like not break it too, right? Like we don't get to the situation where we're like, hey, raise our hand. We're going to solve the electron crisis and deploy all this. And then in 24 months, 36 months, it's going to break. And like, now we're did exactly what they said they were worried about, right? Like we can't do that. So everybody needs to be a good neighbor, a good agent, follow the compliance best practices, bring reliable electrons to the grid, right? Make good equipment choices, make good deployment choices, good operational choices so that those electrons then are reliable and we are truly providing a solution, not just a Band-Aid.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, so well said. I love all of that in there. I think that perfectly just brings us to where we're headed here, and just keep listening. This is why you should care. And then we're going to get into it, but it brings us kind of to the regulatory shift that makes this conversation, I think, so timely. Category 2 is not just a new administrative category. It's a signal that more renewable assets are being treated as consequential participants in bulk power system reliability. Talk us a little bit about that. Like in plain English, what changed with NERC Category 2? Why is it such a big shift for solar, wind, storage, and hybrid assets?
It's really interesting. I actually, and this is probably my hot take, but I actually think it's kind of cool because, traditional generation, so like we've talked a lot about that, or I've mentioned that a lot already, but the hydro facility, the coal plant, et cetera, they all have to be registered with NERC and follow the reliability standards if they're 20 megawatts and above. Right? So little history lesson, we'll go back in time. But when the NERC standards were originally written and the registration threshold was written in June of 2007, went into effect. Okay, so think back here. We're almost to 20 years, wild. But if you think about it, like they never thought renewables could get as big as they are. Right? Like everyone was like, a solar facility, like a 1 megawatt, maybe 5 megawatts was big back then, right? But like people just couldn't imagine that they'd be as big as they are, right? So when I was registering like the first solar facility in 2012, at 100 megawatts, NERC was like, wait, what? But, they wrote the registration criteria in 2007 to say an aggregate of 75 megawatts and above then had to be registered. And the idea was like this aggregation point was interesting. If you think about a solar facility or wind facility at that time, they're spread out over how many acres? 6, 10, 15, 20 acres of land, right? Like it's this large thing. Like you could have a fire on one side of the road and partial, lose a circuit and still generate 70 of your 75 megawatts, right? Like it's interesting, like the physical disparity of a site, and so there's this idea of like, okay, well, the site aggregates at 75, then they need to be registered. Well, over time, over the last 10 years, from really 2012 to about 2022, there's all this analysis of all of those smaller solar sites between 20 megawatts and 75 megawatts. And they're like, you actually do affect the grid and you do affect generation. And when you lose 60 megawatts of solar in the middle of a super, super, super hot day in Texas, like you're in trouble. Like that actually matters. So, the regulators have really pushed and made this change to bring the threshold down to 20 megawatts so that way, we're really actually like covering that gap that exists there. I'd honestly at some point imagine that they might even go down lower, to be honest with you, with what we're hearing and seeing. But for now, this category 2 shift. So my hot take on this, I think it's really flipping cool because it just espouses that renewables is a solution. We actually matter on the grid. Like we're actually solving generational issues. We're getting to be big enough that we make an impact, that we matter. So then, hey, let's be excited about this. Let's register these assets. Let's be compliant. Let's be reliable. Let's make a really good name for the industry.
Yeah, I love that perspective a lot, and it's a signal, right? It's like, yay, we've arrived. Like they're taking us seriously too. We have to do the same. I like that a lot. And you talked about that, that the market often talks about that threshold as 20 megawatts, but I know that the formal language is a little bit more specific. I guess, how should asset owners think about that? Like what's more, is there anything more to that story?
So it's 20 megawatts connected at 60 kV or higher. So if you're connected, sub-distribution level, your site may not be impacted. So, and in some cases, I don't know, we've gone back and forth. We actually saw a site that was like 18.2 megawatts and then, went through some reviews and turns out like it did need to be registered. So I would say like if you're on the cusp of some of those numbers, it's definitely worth some analysis. So maybe don't just, check a box and move on, but maybe dig in just a little bit.
And as you said, like the criteria may change too, and it may become where even less is considered as well too. So probably still good to think about it, even if you're slightly below, as you said, worth looking into and just making sure. Never a bad idea.
Absolutely.
So thinking about this, is this went into effect, recently? Who is most likely to be sort of caught off guard by Category 2? Is it smaller IPPs, developers moving into ownership, asset managers, operators,
Yeah.
investors? Like, what's your thoughts there?
Yeah, I think it's definitely the smaller owners that like don't have bigger facilities. So, like if you have large stuff, like large facilities, like you're already doing this. So you're kind of like it's already kind of on your radar, if that makes sense. But I think there's quite a few like asset owners, like think about the people that built a facility in like 2000 and they just have a couple of smaller assets and that's
Mhm.
kind of it in their portfolio. Like they might not know about this, right? Like it might not be on their radar. So I think that's a big one. And then I think people that are operating these sites that are smaller operations that maybe like don't operate any larger existing
Mhm.
already in NERC sites, like those folks could also be surprised by it as well. So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's important, and wanted to point out out there, maybe there's some listeners that are like, okay, now I'm listening even more so, because
Yeah.
that's me. Now that the May 15 deadline is passed, not too long ago, what should an owner operator do? If they're in that category or they're realizing a little bit late that they may be in scope and may apply to them, like what's the step one? Like what should they start doing today?
Yeah. Well, you definitely, I mean, gosh, I just like really hope people aren't in that. I feel like I've like spent
Yeah.
like the last like 6, 12 months like trying so hard between like LinkedIn and like blogs and like interviews and all the things like to get the word out. Hopefully that isn't the case. But if it is the case, you want to start digging into building a compliance program. And that's going to, to be compliant with Category 2, it's going to require some policies and procedures and getting some documentation put together. And then probably more than likely, auditing your your day-to-day business operational practices and making adjustments so you can be compliant with the standards. So, and, for a lot of folks, especially when you're new to this, it may require that you bring in some outside support to help you figure that out, or if you haven't done anything and you're just finding out about this and you fit in that criteria, you may need some extra help so that you can get compliant really, really quickly
Yeah.
before you're in the situation where you're being audited. Because that's the thing, we had the May 15 deadline to register. As soon as you register, then compliance starts. And you have to be compliant with the standards, which then means that you have to be, following all of the requirements, and then you're going to be audited, right? And so,
Yeah.
that audit, those monitoring processes are going to start here sooner than later. And so you want to have all your ducks in a row, before you.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, hopefully it doesn't apply to anybody that we've been able to get the word out. You've been able to get the word out, but I'm
Yeah.
sure there's some maybe. Thinking about what you just ended there with, what is the true difference? When you think about, hey, I'm registered. I registered. I did what I was supposed to do there. And then the difference of being like truly audit ready. Like what should people think about?
I mean, it's one thing to like check the box and like fill out a form. It's another
Yeah.
to be like, well, here you go. Like here is every single month we did, these five compliance things. We ensured that they were being done correctly. We put these policies and procedures in place, and it's not just paperwork. Like we actually like follow the policies and procedures and being able to show that. There's this concept of an internal compliance program in the NERC space where it's this like, hey, it's one thing to have paperwork, but you actually have to show, like, back it up. Like, did you
Yeah.
train people? Do you have a PowerPoint of it? Do you have training records? Do you continue to train people? Did you test them? Right? It's not just like, here you go, here's a policy, we're good.
Mhm.
Right? Like, it's truly like, is it implemented? Can you demonstrate that it's implemented and then continue to follow through with those things?
I think it's a great way to say it. The real test is that, just whether the evidence controls responsibility hold up under scrutiny. You're actually following the things that you put into place. So, I know the official initial Category 2 standards list is narrower than a lot of public discussion around cybersecurity. What is mandatory now? What's prudent now? And what do you expect to become standard later?
Well, so there are technically right now, letter of the law today. So we're recording this, oh my gosh, July 1st. Welcome to July. We're recording this July 1st, 2026. So if you think about right now, there are 8 standards you have to be compliant with. By the end of 26, so by December of 2026, there's going to be an additional 5 standards that get added. So we'll have 13 standards by the end of this year. And then there's this ongoing process. So if you think about every standard, on average is like 20 pieces of paper to like write the requirements in the
Yeah.
standard, right? Like, so it's not an easy thing to like go through and review every standard and be like, oh, okay, so we have this new group of facilities. Like, do we need to change the language in here because we have this new group of facilities coming in? And so how do we edit that? And so just like, like process and all of that like takes time to edit and revise those standards. So we're going to see over the next 3 years this, and really the next 18 months is going to be hypercritical, but they're going to continue to revise all of those standards. I believe, and this is just Kellie's opinion, but I believe that, by 2029, that the Category 2 sites will have to be compliant with the same standards as the Category 1 sites, the same as every other generational asset on the grid. They'll have to comply with everything. I think it's just literally like prioritizing like how many standards can you update and revise and get through. It's really interesting in our industry, in the NERC space. We go through, really, it's a pretty collective process where you get lots of industry opinions and comments. And so you can imagine you have 30 people opining on, 3 pieces of paper. Like, that's a lot of opinions to sort through and figure out. And so, NERC's actually in a process right now of changing the way that they also edit and revise standards to make things move faster as well, which will be interesting to see how that happens. So I think, there's a lot going on, and there are definitely people that are in the camp of like, oh, this is it. It's just these 8 standards. It's no big deal. It's not a lot. And, we'll see what happens. I think that's cool if that's like the position you want to take. I think historically, like, we've seen FERC push NERC really hard when they felt like there was a gap in reliability. And I think that knowing what we have going on, hearing executive orders, hearing what is happening on the Hill, right? Like that, like where we're headed, even from like a national security perspective and things like that, it's not going to slow down. And I don't see a world where FERC doesn't continue, and they already are, but continue to push NERC to push these changes and standards through super quickly and make those changes really fast. So
yeah, absolutely. Great context there. And I think for those that want to be proactive, maybe they see it as well too. Like, hey, this is probably going to change. And, you said you fast forward out to 2029 and beyond. For those that do want to be proactive and look at that, like what should they be preparing for before the rules may force them to? Like what can they prepare for today?
Yeah, well, and I think that's really interesting because one of the things that's not in that 8 standards in that bucket is cybersecurity. So little history lesson, sorry, lots of history today, but the original NERC standards were released in June of 2007, right? And FERC approved them and said, hey, great job, industry, but you forgot something really important. You forgot cybersecurity and you didn't come up with cybersecurity standards. So in June of 2008, then NERC passed and FERC approved a set of cybersecurity standards. So like, we've seen this happen historically where FERC has come back and said, you forgot something really important, right? So currently right now, we're kind of reliving history. We've got 8 standards. None of them are cybersecurity. I don't see a world where in the next 12 to 18 months, cybersecurity standards are not applicable to those sites. Now, when you put those cybersecurity standards into place, and you start putting access management, electronic access management, patch management, et cetera, what do? Well, you make a better operational facility. Like you are now operating your site. Like think about, we see intrusion attempts all day long, constantly on these sites. Like the electrical grid is under attack. And we haven't really even talked about that today. And that's probably like a whole nother conversation. Yeah. But, the electrical grid is, from a cybersecurity standpoint, like is under attack. And so if you're an owner and you're thinking about all this, like you would be remiss to not be working to be compliant with the cybersecurity standard. And if you think about a site that was built in 2010, like, do you know the password to your firewall? Does your site have a firewall? Like, when's the last time it was patched? When's the last time the Windows system was updated, right? It kind of becomes this like off to the side, like thing that you don't think about. And so it's really interesting. So like if I was any owner right now, like cybersecurity would be number 1 on my list of things I'd be thinking about.
Yeah, I like that number 1 thing to think about as well too. And I think, perfect segue, like reliability and cybersecurity are so deeply connected now. And the modern renewable plan is software enabled, remotely monitored, vendor dependent, integrated into critical infrastructure. And that creates enormous value, but also creates a broader attack surface. So it's really important. And some of this, recent cyber headlines have been more focused on like oil, gas, water, other critical infrastructure. But, I think you've explained that a little bit, but why should clean energy operators just assume they're part of that same risk landscape and be viewing this in the same way?
Yeah, well, I think it's really interesting because there's so many moving parts, right? And I think there's so much equipment out there, but the remote operations is such a big deal. we're so interconnected. You have these MET stations, you have, an O&M wireless network at the O&M building, you have relays that potentially have wireless access. Every device at a solar facility has some sort of connectivity and remote connectivity more often, almost 9 out of 10 times. Take a battery site, for example. Like everything has remote connectivity and the discharge of battery, like all of that, like you could not have a field tech at a battery site, for days on end. And in some cases, like whether good or bad, but just, operational practices, that is the reality of what we're seeing.
And kind of like thinking about that risk kind of within the whole renewable portfolio. I know we've talked a little bit about like commissioning being a very vulnerable point. Why is commissioning such a vulnerable moment for both compliance and cybersecurity?
Okay, just like volume of people.
Yeah.
Like, have you ever been to a solar site when it's being built and you see the parking lot of folks that are on the site required, just like the sheer volume of people to install a solar facility? You go from like hundreds of cars in the parking lot, then you hit commercial operations and you've got like, I don't know, 3 or 4 field techs trucks on a day-to-day basis. Like just like commissioning, building, construction is just like the sheer volume of people. Right? And so you have all these people that are like, oh, we're doing the substation and we're doing this and we're doing that and we're bringing on this circuit. And like, well, I just want to have access to this SCADA so I can see what's going on. So like I can troubleshoot, I can figure this out. And like, and there's all these like LDs. So if we don't meet this timeline and milestone on our construction schedule, it's millions of dollars. And it's so interesting. You have this franticness during commissioning, right? And so you end up in the situation where it's like it's this very open network for the site, right? Like everything is kind of open because you have all these people that are coming together to put the site together. And then you hit commercial operations and, right before you hit commercial operations, at least for us, before we get there, we're locking down and we're like, well, do you have a business case? Like, do you need to have this access anymore? Like maybe it made sense 6 months ago for you to have like unfettered admin access because you were literally setting up the network and like doing things. But now it's like, but you don't have any ongoing business case. So like you no longer need this access. Like we need to pull you from that access. So it's a really interesting, and it kind of becomes a scream test sometimes too, because you're like, okay, like we cannot have all these people. Like, okay, if you're not screaming that you need the access, then you probably don't need the access. So
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that leads perfectly into kind of where I was going to go is like, what are some of the best practices you've seen or you've implemented with commissioning to be able to control that? It makes a lot of sense, just with there are more bodies, more people involved. There's a lot of other things going on. But anything else that you would recommend just in terms of best practices to help mitigate that risk?
I think a lot of that is having good process and procedure, right? And having a way that you're doing it, knowing who has access and really saying, okay, we're 30 days from COD, like start locking down, preparing people, right? Like and doing that. I think electronic access is a big one. I think the other thing is patch management, right? Like, you have, and this is fine. Like, this is okay. I'm not like, this is no shade on, SCADA and SCADA vendors, but, they bulk purchase equipment, right? So you could have a firewall that's been sitting on the shelf for 12 months because they bought, 30 firewalls at one time, right?
Yeah.
For their deployment, for their construction schedule, for 2026. And so, it's really looking at those firewalls and being like, okay, like, like this is outdated and it needs to be updated and it needs to be patched. And so I think there's just some of those best practices that you can absolutely deploy during commissioning that really ensure that your facility is in a good spot,
A good practical advice there. And that's such a simple one, but such an obvious one that's missed a lot of times. It's like even just
Right.
those patch updates and just making sure everything's like, is it up to date and current and has all the things it needs to? It may have been, like as you said, sitting on a shelf for a long time. Let me ask you this. If you walked onto a site tomorrow, what early warning signs would tell you that a project is likely to become a compliance or cybersecurity problem later?
I like get sick to my stomach when you walk into a substation and someone has like the password for the HMI like SCADA system like on a post-it note like right there and you're like, who like that is not a good thing. That's probably my number one. Number two
Yeah.
is like lack of physical security. Like, like that someone was not thoughtful about where they put gates or, where they put access points and things like that. Like if the substation yard is like the main parking spot for everyone is going to be the major point of egress for a site, that makes me very nervous. Yeah,
Yeah.
those are probably my top ones.
Yeah. No, helpful. And people are like, yeah. Who leaves a password on a Post-it note? A lot of people do it. That's what we're talking about it. So don't be one of those.
I have quite a few pictures on my phone.
I bet.
That might be a future LinkedIn post.
Yeah. My lesson out there is like, don't make any assumptions that you're like, our people don't do that. You're like, don't make assumptions.
I mean, like it's just human nature, right? Like you want to be efficient, you want to move quickly, like you're under pressure, there's financial pressure. It's understandable, right? Like people be like, oh, well, I didn't want to pay for more fencing. And it's like, yeah, but you just left this like very critical asset fully exposed, right? But like, I understand why people do it. I can see it. But at the end of the day, you've got to think long-term, big picture of renewable and where we're headed as an industry. And, everyone's got to do their part.
Absolutely. No, great perspective there. So as we talked through the rules a bit, the risks, the technical realities, but ultimately this becomes a leadership question. And so kind of bring it back to that. Mature compliance does not live in one person's inbox. It lives in really the culture, systems, budgets, and priority of the company. And you often frame compliance as a culture issue, and I would totally agree, not just a documentation issue. So what does a healthy compliance culture look like inside of a renewable company today?
Yeah, I mean, I love when executives, at least at a high level, understand what NERC compliance is, right? And they understand reliability because, every single person at that exec table should be sitting there. And when you're making hard decisions about things, there should at least be a pause to say, how does this affect our compliance program? Are there any implications to our compliance program, right? And very often there isn't someone in the room to ask that question because you don't have that engagement at the exec level, and for me, I think that's really, really important. I think, not that you need to be an expert, not that you need to understand everything, but I think you should have to sit through a 30-minute NERC for executive training and understand NERC 101. Like, this is why it's important, and these are the financial outcomes as well and the risks. I think, there comes with significant, civil penalties if you're not following the NERC standards correctly. And I think, that's something that executives don't understand either because they're like, oh, well, this is just an operational thing. And well, it is, but, when you get that fine, that's, north of $500,000, how does that affect, that does become important and material. And so I think, really seeing, leadership engage and dig in is really important. And I think as part of like becoming, putting myself up to be elected for the SEIA board and campaigning for that position, I wanted to be able to help bring some of that perspective there and, get to spend time with those folks.
Yeah, I love that a lot. I think that culture piece is crucial, because to your point, like documentation only works when the organization actually behaves the way the documents say it does and they really believe in it. And it comes from the top. I think that true buy-in that, people, they see what's unspoken, they read those things kind of like, and it's not front of mind for the executive. It doesn't feel important to the executive. Even if they say it is, then that kind of trickles down the organization. So I agree with you 100%. It starts there, starts with the person being bought in and, invest some little time. Like to your point, you don't have to be this expert of all things in it, but at least just spend some time familiarizing yourself with it, getting to know it. What are some other things? So thinking about like the executive, CEOs, CFOs, boards, investors, what else should they understand about just compliance risks that maybe they often underestimate?
Yeah. Well, I think the financial impact is always something that they find surprising. That's definitely one of them. And then usually the time that it takes to implement too, right? Because they'll say, hey, let's, the site's underperforming. Let's make these equipment changes. Well, that's great. We can make those equipment changes, but we have to run an engineering analysis and make sure, and then there has to be a change management program and make sure that the equipment is deployed correctly and in a compliant manner. And oftentimes it's seen as this bureaucratic red tape and, and that's always challenging. And so I think understanding that there's a financial implication, reputational implication, and then, there is a time implication and it can slow things down if you're not planning and thinking about it ahead of time. But if that's always in your forefront and you come through a lens of a culture of compliance and you start planning from the beginning, it isn't that challenge.
Yeah, absolutely. It's such an important message, I think, for executives because that compliance risk, to your point, can become operational risk, financial risk, time risk, reputational risk really, really quickly. And I think that framing should resonate as well. And I've said this before in the show, but this would apply in this case too, is like that saying like best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago. Next best time is today. Start today. Get on it, because to your point, it does take time as well too. For a company listening that is behind, what would you prioritize and say, let's the first 90 days to reduce risk quickly and build the foundation correctly?
I think there's just a lot of ensuring that the equipment that you're deploying is correct. So a big one is inverter settings, right? There's requirements for inverter settings and the standards are really specific. And so the first 90 days is like, yeah, these are the as-left settings, but are they actually compliant, and ensuring that they're compliant?
Yeah. Good, easy starting place. Gives you a realistic starting place. I wanted to do that as well too. 3 years from now, right? So what will separate the renewable operators who earned long-term trust from the ones who are still playing catch up? What will separate the ones that really get this right and do this well?
Well, they won't be on the radar of NERC because they won't be in trouble and they won't have paid financial penalties. I think at the end of the day, there'll be less friction in the industry, right? They're going to be the ones that are like, oh yes, I'd like to sign an interconnection agreement with you. They are going to not see the friction through the development process. They're not going to see the friction through the monitoring and audit process. And, it's really going to be feeling more like a partnership.
Absolutely. And I think a great place to land there, because the industry's next phase, again, is not just about more capacity, it's about more trusted, reliable capacity. So this has been so great. Kellie, thank you so much for joining Green Giants. This is a fantastic conversation because it takes a topic that can sound technical or administrative from the outside and brings it back to what really matters, that reliability, resilience, security, public trust. For everyone out there listening, the big takeaway is clear. Renewable energy is no longer a future resource sitting at the edge of the system. It's central infrastructure. And that means the standards are rising, the risks are changing, and the best operators will be the ones who build compliance and cybersecurity into the way they develop, commission, and run assets every day. Thanks as always for listening to Green Giants, Titans of Renewable Energy. If this conversation was valuable, please subscribe, rate the show, share it with your network, and check the show notes as well. These are the conversations that help the industry mature, and we appreciate you being a part of them. With that, we'll see you next week.
This episode of Green Giants, Titans of Renewable Energy, was brought to you by Lee Group Search. If you enjoyed today's discussion and are looking to recruit top talent for your company or find your next career opportunity in the renewable energy sector, visit leegroupsearch.com. Let's continue driving the future of clean energy together. Until next time, keep pushing toward a greener future.